Think for a moment about the electricity powering the device you're listening on right now. It might surprise you, but for many people, a significant chunk of that power, maybe even a third, actually comes from nuclear energy.
It really does, and it's fascinating how common it is, yet how much debate surrounds it.
Exactly. That's our topic for today, and it's far more complex and fascinating than most people probably realize. From, quietly powering our homes to being right at the center of global decarbonization goals, nuclear energy is always being talked about. Our mission today is to kind of cut through the usual perceptions and really unpack what makes it tick, what it costs, its actual track record, and what its future might look like for you. We've pulled together quite a range of sources, economic analyses, historical accounts, global energy outlooks, just to give you a really well-informed perspective.
Yeah, and what's really striking about nuclear power, I think, is how deeply intertwined the technical side, the economics, and even the geopolitical aspects are. We'll try to connect those dots, link it to the bigger picture, helping you move beyond just the headlines and really grasp the complex web of factors at play. Hopefully lead to some real aha moments along the way.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning then.
Yeah.
How do you actually get electricity from an atom? It all kicks off with something called nuclear fission. So imagine a uranium-235 atom. It's inherently unstable, kind of like a spring-loaded mousetrap just waiting.
That's a great analogy. Exactly. And when you hit that unstable uranium-235 atom with just one fast neutron, boom, it splits apart. Now, this doesn't just release an incredible amount of heat, that's the energy we harness, but it also kicks off like 2 or 3 new fast neutrons.
Ah,
And those new neutrons can then go on to strike other uranium-235 atoms. So you get this self-sustaining chain reaction, just like one mousetrap setting off a whole bunch of others. Controlling that reaction is, well, the core of nuclear power generation.
and the very first time this was actually done for electricity. That was December 20th, 1951. At the Experimental Breeder Reactor 1, EBR-1, they called it out at the Idaho National Laboratory. They successfully generated electricity. They started small, I think it was 4 300-watt light bulbs. Then the next day, it powered the entire facility.
Yeah, an incredible moment, really groundbreaking and deeply symbolic. How nuclear research first developed for wartime was now being used for peaceful energy, a real swords into plowshares kind of thing.
That one.
And what's particularly clever about EBR-1, especially for that era, was their design choices. Really innovative. See, unlike most modern reactors that use water to cool the core, EBR-1 used this unique liquid metal coolant, a mix of sodium and potassium called N.
And NEC. Okay, why NEC?
Well, it was essential because NEC stays liquid at room temperature, but crucially, it doesn't slow down the fast neutrons needed for that specific reactor's function. Water would slow them down.
Right, which would mess up the whole process they were aiming for.
Exactly. And they were incredibly clever with their safety features, too. They had this ingenious triple-loop heat exchange system.
Triple loop, so like 3 layers of safety.
Pretty much. Think of it as 3 distinct isolated layers. Loop 1 had the highly radioactive Ma, taking heat right from the reactor core. Then, Loop 2, with less radioactive Na, exchanged heat with the first loop, but it physically isolated the hottest, most radioactive coolant.
Okay, isolating the really dangerous stuff.
Right. But the real genius part, I think, was loop 3. It contained water and exchanged heat with the second Ni loop, but, and this is key, with an added argon gas barrier between the coolants.
Argon gas, why?
Well, that argon barrier was critical. It was there to prevent a massive explosion if the Na and the water ever accidentally mix. They react quite violently.
Okay, wow, so built-in protection against a chemical reaction.
Precisely. Then the heated water in that third loop turned into steam, spun a turbine, drove a generator, and bingo electricity. Multi-layered safety designed completely from scratch.
And controlling the reactor itself, you mentioned it was different. No control rods like today.
No, completely different. EBR-1 used a physical breeding blanket made of uranium-238.
A blanket? How did that work?
Well, you'd raise this blanket, and it would reflect neutrons back into the core, starting the nuclear reaction. To shut it down, to scram it, they'd just drop the blanket.
Just drop it.
Yep. Gravity did the work. Neutrons escaped. Reaction stopped. Simple, effective. Gravity was literally a key safety element in its shutdown.
That's amazing.
And that breeding blanket name points to EBR-1's other big role. It wasn't just making heat for electricity. It was also breeding new fuel. It turned uranium-238 into plutonium-239 by hitting it with those excess fast neutrons.
So it made power and fuel.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating is that it was designed with the capability to actually create more plutonium fuel than the uranium fuel it started with.
Whoa, okay,
Yeah.
that's pretty revolutionary. So they weren't just splitting atoms for power, they were creating new fuel at the same time, all while designing in these clever safety measures from scratch.
Exactly. Sets a precedent for innovation that still drives the field today. Which, raises an important question. How do these foundational principles and historical innovations inform the designs and safety considerations of today's nuclear power plants, especially the advanced concepts we're hearing about?
Good question. Okay, let's shift gears a bit now. From the fascinating science to, well, the hard numbers. The economics of nuclear power, specifically from a private investor's viewpoint. There's this paper from the German Institute for Economic Research, DIW Berlin, and they tackled this exact question. You know, would nuclear power be a viable investment for a private company in a competitive electricity market?
Right. And their method involved using Monte Carlo simulations, basically running thousands of possible scenarios to analyze key economic indicators, things like net present value, NPV, and the levelized cost of electricity, LCOE. And it's important to remember their scope here. They focused specifically on Western market economies, Europe, the US, and they explicitly excluded a lot of things.
Like what?
Well, public policy support, environmental benefits or costs, broader cost-benefit analyses, proliferation risks, and crucially, the cause of decommissioning, long-term waste storage, or potential accidents. This was purely about the commercial viability for an investor.
Okay, so just the raw business case. What did they find were the biggest cost issues?
The big one was construction costs, what they call overnight construction costs, or OCC. These make up a huge chunk of the LCOE, often like 60 to 80% of the total cost.
And we've seen this play out in reality, haven't we?
Absolutely. Just look at the big Framatome EPR projects, Olkiluoto 3 in Finland, Hinkley Point C in the UK. Their initial cost estimates they ballooned. Hinkley Point C, for example, went from an estimate of about 18 billion US dollars in 2013 to something like 27 billion just 2 years later. That works out to roughly $8,300 per kilowatt of capacity. Huge numbers.
Wow. And it's worth remembering, as the paper noted, that back in 2019 when they wrote it, no generation of the third or three plus reactors were actually up and running commercially in North America or Europe yet. These were still projections based on projects under construction.
Exactly. And beyond just building the thing, there's the interest during construction, the IDC. That also turned out to be a major cost driver.
Right, because these things take so long to build.
Precisely. Think of it like paying interest on a massive mortgage for, say, 10 years before you even get the keys to the house. That interest just keeps piling up. The paper showed that with a 10-year construction period and an 8% cost of capital, that's the WACC, the IDC alone makes up about a third of the total construction cost.
A third, just in interest.
Yep. And if construction drags on to 15 years, that share jumps to about 41% on average. It really hammers home how much delays and financing costs impact the final bill, even before the plant sells a single kilowatt hour.
So what does this all mean then? What was the study's main takeaway for private investors?
The conclusion was pretty clear-cut and robust, according to the study. The simulations, for most scenarios, show that investing in new nuclear power plants is just not profitable for private investors. They found highly negative expected net present values, mostly because of those massive construction and capital costs, plus uncertainty about future electricity prices, which might be low.
Did extending the plant's life help much? Say, running it for 60 years instead of 40?
Apparently not significantly, no. The study found that even extending lifetimes didn't really change the negative financial picture for private investors in these markets.
So even without factoring in those massive long-term costs like waste disposal or potential accidents, the pure financial numbers for private investors just aren't adding up in a competitive market.
That seems to be the finding. And this wasn't entirely new either. Even before this DIW study, traditional economics literature often pointed out that nuclear investments struggle to compete under regular market conditions. So if we connect this to the bigger picture, it highlights a critical challenge. Nuclear energy is incredibly capital intensive. Projects take a very long time, and that creates huge financial risk, especially in liberalized electricity markets where prices fluctuate. It suggests that if new nuclear gets built, it probably needs different financial structures than pure private investment-seeking market returns.
Okay, that's a sobering look at the economics. Let's pivot now to another really important and often quite debated topic, the safety record. What are the actual facts about risks and, sadly, deaths? Let's start with Chernobyl, 1986. It looms large in the public mind.
It really does, and the tragedy was undeniably immense. But when you dig into the extensive studies and the actual numbers, the picture becomes more, well, nuanced. Immediately, or very soon after the incident, 30 people died. That was 2 plant workers killed instantly in the explosion, and 28 emergency workers and firemen who died in the following weeks from acute radiation syndrome, or ARS.
Okay, 30 initial deaths among those directly involved. What about others exposed?
Well, there were 134 workers diagnosed with ARS who survived the initial period. By 2006, a further 19 of those survivors had died. But, and this is important, many of those later deaths were from causes unrelated to radiation. Things like TB, heart attacks, strokes.
So not necessarily caused by the radiation exposure itself.
Not definitively for many of them. The analysis suggests only about 5 of those later deaths were from cancers, where a link to radiation is considered plausible.
Right. What about the wider impact? There were concerns about cancers, particularly thyroid cancer in children.
Yes, that's a known consequence. Approximately 5,000 cases of thyroid cancer, mostly in those who were children or adolescents at the time, were attributed to radiation exposure from contaminated milk, primarily.
That sounds terrible.
It is serious, but it's also crucial to note the prognosis for this specific type of cancer is generally very good. We're talking 20-year survival rates around 92% and 40-year rates around 98%. Based on those survival rates, the estimated number of eventual deaths from these specific childhood thyroid cancers is somewhere between 96 and 395. A tragedy for each family, absolutely, but far fewer than some initial, much larger estimates suggested.
What about the general population, the millions who lived in contaminated areas or were involved in the cleanup?
That's where the science has become much clearer over time. Initially, there was huge public concern, and estimates for excess cancer deaths ranged wildly, from 4,000 up to 60,000 or even more. However, large-scale studies published after 2010, including major reports from the World Health Organization and the UN Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, UNSCEAR, have found no demonstrable increase in cancer rates or other radiation-related health impacts that can be reliably attributed to Chernobyl among the wider populations in the affected regions.
No demonstrable increase. That's quite different from the common perception.
It is. The long-term psychological impacts and stress-related health issues are significant, absolutely, but direct radiation-induced illness in the general population hasn't materialized in the way many feared.
What about 3 Mile Island in 1979? That was another big incident.
It was rated a level 5 accident with wider consequences on the scale. However, our sources don't actually report any direct deaths resulting from the TMI accident. There was a partial meltdown, significant reactor damage, and some release of radioactivity, but containment largely held, and population exposure was calculated to be very low.
You know, when you actually look at these raw numbers, the facts, and then compare them to other energy sources, well, the safety record of nuclear starts to look quite different than maybe popular perception suggests.
It really does. If you look at metrics like deaths per terawatt hour of electricity generated, nuclear power comes out very low. It's comparable to renewables like solar and wind.
Which aren't zero either, right? There are accidents in manufacturing, installation, maintenance.
Exactly. Things like falls, transport accidents, even helicopter crashes for offshore wind maintenance, or fires during panel production for solar. They're rare, but they happen. Nuclear's rate is in that same very low bracket.
How does it compare to something like hydropower? People often think of hydro as very clean and safe.
Generally, yes. But hydropower's overall historical death rate per TWH is actually higher, about 1.3 deaths per TWH. But that number is almost entirely dominated by one single catastrophic event: the Bangqiu Dam failure in China in 1975.
Bangqiu. I'm not sure I know that
It
one.
was devastating. An estimated 171,000 people died, mostly in the ensuing floods when the dam collapsed during a typhoon. It's one of the worst industrial accidents in history.
171,000. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Now, if you take that one massive outlier out of the data, hydropower's death rate drops dramatically to about 0.04 deaths per TWH, which is, again, right down there with nuclear, wind, and solar.
So these single, huge, low probability but high consequence events really skew the perception for both hydro and nuclear, it seems.
It seems so, and it really raises a fascinating question. How do societies weigh these perceived risks versus the empirically demonstrated safety records when making really big, long-term energy policy decisions? Especially now with the backdrop of, global challenges like climate change, where energy choices have such massive consequences.
That's a tough balance. Okay, let's talk about another persistent concern: the waste. Nuclear reactors produce this highly radioactive, toxic byproduct. and it stays dangerous for a really, really long time. Tens
Yeah.
of thousands of years, right?
That's correct. It's definitely a long-term management challenge, no question about it. But interestingly, some of our sources frame it in a specific way. They argue that managing nuclear waste is actually considered a much easier environmental problem to solve than climate change.
Easier than climate change. How can
Yeah.
they say that?
Well, the main reason cited is the potential for recycling. Apparently, up to 90% of the nuclear waste generated, specifically the spent fuel, can theoretically be recycled.
Recycling nuclear waste. You mean reusing the fuel?
Essentially, yes. Reprocessing the spent fuel allows you to extract the remaining uranium and the plutonium that was created, which can then be used to fabricate new fuel. This significantly reduces the volume and the long-term radiotoxicity of the final waste that needs disposal. France and Russia, for example, do this commercially.
Okay, so recycling is a big part of the argument. What about the waste from newer reactors? These small modular reactors, SMRs, and advanced generation 4V designs we hear about.
That's a really important point. These new reactor designs will produce waste, and it might have different characteristics chemically, physically, radioactively than the waste from current large reactors.
So we need a plan for that too.
Exactly. And there's a proactive approach emerging. The Nuclear Energy Agency, the NEA, has launched something called the WIZARD project.
WIZARD, what's that stand for?
Waste Integration for Small and Advanced Reactor Designs. The whole idea is to integrate waste management thinking right from the very beginning, during the design phase of these new SMRs and advanced reactors.
So designing the waste management into the reactor almost.
Pretty much. Instead of just figuring out what to do with the waste afterwards, they want to anticipate the issues, maybe even design away some of the problems, and make sure we're much better prepared for handling and disposing of these future waste streams right from day one.
It's not just about what comes out of the reactor today, but what happens to it over the very long term. The idea of designing waste management from the start is pretty forward thinking, literally building the solution into the problem.
Absolutely. It marks a fascinating shift, moving from just reacting to waste after it's created to this integrated design philosophy. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, what other industries could maybe benefit from that kind of design it away approach, thinking about the long-term consequences right from the outset.
Good point. Okay, let's zoom out now and look at the global picture. Where does nuclear power stand today, and where might it be heading? What's the current status?
Well, as of late July 2024, the numbers look like this. There are 415 nuclear reactors operating across more than 30 countries worldwide. Together, they provide about 370 gigawatts of electric capacity, GWE.
415 reactors. Which countries have the most?
The biggest players in terms of installed capacity are the United States, France, China, Russia, South Korea, Canada, and Japan. Those 7 hold the largest fleets.
And what about new reactors being built? Is there much construction happening?
Yes, quite a bit, actually. Currently, there are 62 reactors under construction in 17 different countries. When they come online, they'll add another 74 GWE of capacity.
Where is most of that construction happening?
Asia is a major hub, especially China and India. Russia also has significant construction ongoing, as does Europe and the Middle East. It's also interesting to note that over a third of those reactors under construction, 25 out of the 62, are Russian VVER reactor designs.
Okay, so activity in specific regions. What about future plans, beyond what's already being built?
Well, looking further ahead, there are over 100 new reactors in various stages of planning around the globe, and significantly, 13 European countries are now actively preparing for large-scale deployment of nuclear energy. Plus, you have countries like Bangladesh, Poland, and Turkey entering the nuclear energy market for the very first time.
So definite signs of renewed interest and expansion plans.
Absolutely. And this global momentum got a huge push at the COP28 climate conference in December 2023.
Ah, yes, I remember hearing about that. What happened there?
Over 20 world leaders signed a declaration committing to make efforts to triple global nuclear energy capacity by the year 2050.
Triple it. By 2050, that sounds ambitious.
It is hugely ambitious. To hit that target, the world would basically need to quadruple the rate at which new nuclear plants are built each year. We're currently averaging about 7 GWE of new capacity per year. We'd need to ramp that up to somewhere between 25 and 30 GWE per year, sustained over the coming decades.
Wow. Why such a big push?
Primarily to meet those net zero carbon emissions goals that countries are setting, and also to ensure energy security, having reliable power sources domestically. Nuclear is seen by these countries as a key tool for both.
Here's where it gets really interesting then. Despite those economic hurdles we talked about earlier from the DIW study, there seems to be this powerful global momentum. to really ramp up nuclear energy. And a big part of that story seems to be these small modular reactors, SMRs. They seem to be leading the charge for a potential new era.
They really are. SMRs have emerged over the last decade or so as a new option. The idea is they offer more flexibility in design, potentially faster construction, and suitability for different applications, not just large-scale grid power, but maybe industrial heat or powering remote locations.
Are any actually operating yet? Or is it still mostly conceptual?
No, they're moving beyond concept. SMRs are already deployed and operating in China and Russia. Others are under construction in places like Japan and Argentina.
And North America seems to be a hotbed for designing them.
Definitely. About 35% of the SMR design organizations globally are based in North America. And right now, there are over 25 potential sites being looked at just in the US and Canada for possible SMR deployment. Plus, we've seen recent regulatory approvals for 3 specific SMR designs. Nuscale's VOYGR in the US, Kairi's SMART in Korea, and Kairos Power's Hermes, also in the US. So the regulatory pathway is starting to open up.
So, connecting this to the bigger picture, it really underscores how deeply many nations now seem to view nuclear energy, not just as an option, but maybe as an essential tool for hitting those ambitious climate targets and ensuring stable energy supplies in what feels like a rapidly changing world.
That seems to be the driving force behind this renewed global push, yes.
Okay, so there's momentum, there's interest, there are new technologies like SMRs, but let's be realistic. Growth isn't guaranteed. What are the major roadblocks? We touched on finance earlier.
Financing remains a huge one. As we discussed, even if system cost analyses suggest nuclear can be competitive over its whole lifetime, those massive upfront costs are incredibly sensitive to the cost of capital, interest rates, basically.
Right, you gave that example. 2/3 of the cost could be financed if capital costs are 9%, but less than a third if they're down to 3%.
Exactly. And just the sheer scale of investment needed for the reactors, the safety systems, the infrastructure, combined with construction and regulatory processes often stretching over a decade, it puts immense strain on both private companies and government budgets.
And the fact that many Western countries haven't built much nuclear for decades hasn't helped either, right? Loss of skills, supply chains.
Precisely. That gap, roughly 2 decades, in many OECD countries without significant new builds, led to an atrophy, as you said, in the supply chain and the specialized workforce. And that, in turn, has directly contributed to the major cost overruns and delays we've seen on recent first-of-a-kind projects in the West. They're essentially relearning how to do it efficiently.
And the way energy markets are structured now adds another layer of difficulty.
It does. The move towards liberalized and restructured energy markets since the 70s and 80s, with fluctuating prices and emphasis on short-term returns, has really complicated the traditional financing models that suited large, long-term projects like nuclear power plants.
Plus, you mentioned that major international financial institutions often exclude nuclear.
That's a significant hurdle. Most major international financial institutions, like the World Bank, either formally exclude nuclear projects or simply omit them from their lists of eligible investments. The European Investment Bank, for instance, hasn't financed a new nuclear build since 1987.
Why does that matter so much if governments or private companies want to invest?
Well, it has a big knock-on effect. These institutions heavily influence public-private partnerships. Their stance sends signals to private investors. And indirectly, they influence things like international sustainable finance, taxonomies, lists of what counts as green investment, which can guide huge amounts of capital. If nuclear isn't on the list, it's much harder to attract funding.
Although the QOT 28 declaration specifically called for that to change, right? For them to include nuclear in lending policies.
Yes, that was a key point in the declaration. Whether those institutions will change their stance remains to be seen, but the pressure is mounting.
Are there any new financing models being tried?
Yes, there are some emerging approaches, things like regulated revenues, where the government essentially guarantees a certain price or revenue stream. We've seen versions of this with power purchase agreements for projects like Akuyu in Turkey or Baraka in the UAE, and the contract for difference model for Hinkley Point C in the UK. There's also cost recovery regulation, where utilities can start recovering construction costs from ratepayers before the plant is finished, like with Vogtle 3 and 4 in the US, or the regulated asset-based model proposed for Sizewell C in the UK. Different ways to try and manage that huge upfront financial risk.
Okay, so financing is complex. What about the actual physical supply chain? Building the components, getting the materials.
That's challenge number 2, supply chain readiness. You need this whole ecosystem, a virtuous circle, as one source called it, where robust financing supports a skilled workforce, which in turn supports a healthy supply chain.
And historically, nuclear needed a very specialized chain.
It's extremely diverse, highly skilled businesses across mining uranium, precision engineering, heavy construction, complex operations, waste management, the lot. And as we mentioned, a lack of consistent investment leads to that atrophy. Companies leave the sector, skills are lost, and then getting parts or specialized services becomes much harder and more expensive.
And it's getting even more complex now.
Yes, because you have new technologies coming in, advanced manufacturing, AI, robotics, complex data management, 3D printing. Plus, geopolitical factors mean you have to manage things like cybersecurity, physical security, and guarding against counterfeit or substandard components in what's described as a really labyrinthine global supply chain. It's a massive management challenge.
Is there enough confidence in the market for suppliers to invest?
That's a key question. One interesting finding was that supply chain companies seem to need a higher expectation of future growth before they'll invest if that growth depends on selling internationally compared to selling domestically. It suggests maybe less confidence in their ability to compete globally or in the stability of international demand.
How are they tracking resources, like uranium fuel?
The NEA plays a big role here. They published the Red Book, which assesses global uranium resources, and they're working on an Orange Book to cover the rest of the fuel cycle, things like enrichment services and fuel fabrication. These are crucial for ensuring a stable, resilient supply, especially for the new types of fuel needed for advanced reactors, like high-assay, low-enriched uranium, or ALE.
Okay, finance, supply chain.
Yeah.
What's next? You mentioned workforce earlier.
Yes, the talent pipeline. This might actually be the nuclear energy industry's single greatest growth challenge, potentially even more so than the technical hurdle.
Really? More than the technology?
That's the concern.
Yeah.
Simply finding, attracting, training, and then retaining enough skilled people is proving incredibly difficult.
Why is it so hard?
Several factors are colliding. You've got declining birth rates in many developed countries, the baby boomer generation with huge amounts of nuclear experience retiring en masse, and frankly, a very wide range of other attractive high-tech career choices competing for the same talent pool.
And the skills needed are changing too.
Exactly. It's not just the traditional nuclear engineers and physicists anymore, though you still need them desperately. Now, you also need expertise in data management, AI, robotics, advanced IT, cybersecurity, alongside the core science, technology, engineering, and math, the STEM skills.
Is anything being done to try and fix this pipeline problem?
Yes. The NEA, for example, has launched an initiative called Plan 2035, specifically to try and rebuild that workforce pipeline. It focuses on things like outreach much earlier, even to upper secondary schools, using digital platforms better, offering mentorship programs and internships, and really pushing for more diversity, inclusivity, and gender balance in the sector. They have things like a Rising Stars program aimed at supporting women in nuclear careers.
So a concerted effort is underway, but it sounds like a major long-term challenge.
Definitely.
Okay, one last major challenge area: nuclear non-proliferation. The worry that the technology or materials for peaceful nuclear energy could be diverted to make weapons.
Yes, this is the persistent shadow hanging over nuclear energy. The main tool we have is the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. It's arguably the most significant multilateral arms control agreement we have, aiming to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons while allowing peaceful uses of nuclear technology.
But it has weaknesses.
Its main weakness is that it's still far from universality, as one source put it. Several countries with significant nuclear capabilities, things called threshold states, think Argentina, Brazil, India, Israel, Pakistan, South Africa, historically haven't joined the treaty as non-nuclear weapon states.
So that creates a dilemma.
A fundamental one. How do you let nations benefit from peaceful nuclear energy, which the NPT allows, while ensuring adequate safeguards are in place to prevent that technology or material being used destructively? The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, and its safeguard system are the key control mechanisms here. There are ongoing efforts to strengthen those safeguards and, quote, plug loopholes in international nuclear trade to try and keep that barrier between peaceful and military uses as strong as possible.
So what does this all mean? When you put it all together, the finance, the supply chain, the talent, the proliferation risk, it's clear that while the technology itself is powerful, the human, financial, and logistical challenges are just immense. It really is a complex web of interconnected problems.
It absolutely is, which leads back to that core question. How can policy frameworks and, crucially, international collaboration actually work together effectively to overcome these interconnected challenges, especially if we want to meet those ambitious net zero targets and ensure global energy security?
That really is the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it?
You could say that.
We have covered a huge amount of ground today in this deep dive. We started right back at the beginning, understanding the basic science of fission and looking at that incredible historical milestone, EBR-1, and how it ingeniously turned atoms into electricity while pioneering safety and even breeding fuel. Then we really dug into the complex economic realities, especially for private investors, looking at those daunting construction and capital costs highlighted by the DIW study.
hmm And we examined the safety record, looking at the actual data from major incidents like Chernobyl, comparing it to other energy sources, and seeing how it often contrasts with maybe the common perception. We also explored the long-term challenge of managing nuclear waste, but also the potential for recycling and innovative future approaches like the Wizard Project, designing solutions from the start.
Right. And then we surveyed the current global landscape where nuclear stands today, the significant construction and planning underway, the rise of SMRs, and that big push from COP28 to potentially triple capacity by 2050.
But we also had to confront the significant hurdles, the immense challenges in financing these projects, ensuring the readiness of complex global supply chains, building and maintaining the essential talent pipeline, perhaps the biggest challenge of all, and the ever-present need to manage non-proliferation risks.
It really underscores that nuclear power isn't a simple yes or no proposition. It's clearly a continually evolving field.
Absolutely. It holds, immense potential as a source of clean, reliable energy, but it comes with these significant ongoing challenges that need constant attention and innovation. It's undeniably a critical, if complex, part of the global conversation about energy transition and climate change.
So here's a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. As you consider the factual safety record we discussed, alongside those significant economic hurdles, but also weigh the global imperatives for decarbonization and energy security, how might our collective understanding of what investment success means for nuclear power need to evolve? Maybe beyond just simple profitability for private firms to somehow truly account for its broader societal and environmental benefits, or its potential role in our energy future.